We want to thank the McCall, Donnelly, and Cascade Chambers of Commerce, Valley Soil and Water Conservation District, Wampin Homes, the Star News, the McCall Cascade Store, Big Payette Lake Water Quality Council Incorporated, Pam and Ralph Thier, and Friends of Lake Cascade for sponsoring this summit and bringing us all together. This is, as I said, session 1. We're going to have Governor Little will be joining us. And also we're going to have him take a question from Miss Maney's 4th grade class. And that'll start off the summit. I'm going to do a quick screen share so that folks can see the agenda for today. Quick being the operative word here. So we've just finished up our welcome and introductions, and we're now going to transition to the governor's opening comments. And then we're going to enjoy conversations with our local mayors about what water quality means to them. And then we'll transition to a brief history of Cascade Reservoir, Big Payette Lake. We'll talk about historical lessons learned, hearing from Ken Roberts. We've got current watershed conditions and recent monitoring results, status of the local fishery, watershed management issues and opportunities, and Cascade Reservoir. And then we'll hear from Boise National Forest water quality programs and hear from Idaho Department of Lands. And we'll wrap up with a brief Q&A. So that's the plan. It's going to be a fun ride. So thanks everybody for joining. And I'm going to stop my screen share now, and we'll see if we have the governor's office on. Let's see, there we go, Governor Little. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to turn the mic over to you and let you take it away. Thank you.
Well, it looks like you got a great program, so I'll try and get out of the way of all the different parts and pieces that you put together. Just from the outset, you know, Idaho, and it may not appear as you look out the window where you are right now, is you know, as part of an arid desert. You know, for the most part, over our history, water quantity has been the most prominent issue in our historical discussions. But equally important to me is water quality, and it's going to get to be more and more that as we go on. Protecting both our supply and quality are just key to ensuring Idaho maintains our sovereignty, that we basically can determine our future only if we take care of both. Anyone who's listened to me for the last couple of years knows my overarching goal, and that's to increase prosperity for everyone here and to retain our kids here in Idaho. And to me, water quality is one of the most critical parts of it. You know, people want to enjoy what we've always had here traditionally. And degraded water quality is an impediment to that. And that not only to the quality of life, but to industry, to development, to everything. And so a lot of these problems can be taken care of, or best taken care of early rather than later. And I see on your program you're going to address a lot of that. The health of our streams and lakes, many of you were at what I call the head of the ditch at the top of the Payette River drainage, where those of us that live in Emmett are at the bottom of the ditch, as is the whole Columbia River Basin system. So there's a lot of people who have an interest in this issue, whether they're in the Valley County, Boise County area, or whether they're in the Payette and Jim County area, and of course the entire rest of the Pacific Northwest. Agriculture, fish and wildlife, and recreation are all critical. I'm proud of what we've done in the last few years at DEQ to take over primacy from EPA. That will allow the state to do things faster, and it's a really kind of a big layer of bureaucracy in what we do with water quality, and it gives the decision maker to those that are closest to the ground, where they have that knowledge, and also point source and non-point sources alike. But I believe that those priorities are reflected in our most recent budget proposal, which is taking place as we speak here in the legislative process. I have recommended to the legislature an additional $9 million for water quality, including funds to help small communities struggling to upgrade their wastewater and drinking water systems. And the mayors can either agree or disagree with that. They're going to be following me. I'm also putting additional funds into incent agriculture to implement more best management practices to improve non-point source water quality. These types of collaboratives are what need to be put together between citizens and agencies to identify the problems, and as I said earlier, to address them earlier. That little bit of work early can really resolve a bigger issue. I was pretty involved in the phosphate study on well, then we called it Cascade Reservoir before we started calling it Cascade Lake, and did a pretty deep dive into a lot of that information. You know, we've got some challenges in the Valley County area, just background phosphate that exists, and I'm sure that this group will address that. But the last thing we want in Idaho is blue-green algae. But by the time we get blue-green algae, we've already had a problem. What we need to do is do the recommendations before we get that. And it doesn't matter whether it's in Cascade Lake, whether it's in Bradley Reservoir, whether it's in any of the system, whether it's in Lake Coeur d'Alene, we need to do what we can, particularly in this changing climate that we have, to make sure that we've done all we can to prevent that. And of course, you'll also see some incentives from me on what we can do to better manage our upland timber grounds, make sure we don't have those catastrophic fires. We know what kind of water quality issues we have after that. So these are all important things we need to do, and I look forward to input from this group and enjoy what looks like a very compelling agenda that you have for you today. So thank you very much.
Governor, thank you very much for your comments. If you have just a moment, I'd like to have you field a question from Melissa Maney, one of our school teachers here at Donnelly Elementary School.
I'd be delighted.
All right, Melissa, the floor is yours.
Melissa, I think you're muted. I think you're muted, or we didn't get enough money for broadband.
And Melissa, we're gonna GC, can you unmute?
Hi.
There we go.
All right.
Okay. All right. This question, it was supposed to be from my students, but today's a teacher work day. So these are my students. I teach 4th grade up here, and we study the foundations of government. And the class tried to develop a list of what their priorities would be if they were governor. And we linked it to the idea of what we study, or where we study science, which is in our backyard at Boulder Lake, and the importance of clean water. And we wanted to know, how do you develop the list of your priorities to take care of our community, and where would the priority of Boulder Lake to them, or clean water to the general public, how do you prioritize that? Where does it fall?
Well, I mean, it goes back to what Melissa, thank you, and thank your students. What I said earlier, you know, prosperity takes place in many areas, and if you don't have a healthy watershed, and of course that goes to everything from biological diversity, soil health, water health, to dynamic riparian areas, healthy wildlife, and it's all tied together to increase quality of life, not only for the quantity of water. You know, if we have a better watershed, we won't have to use that precious, as much of that precious storage capacity in our irrigation system. We'll retain it in the ground, in the watershed, in the snow cover. So it's all tied together. I think the issue to me is really short-term versus long-term. Too often we look at the short-term ramifications or long-term, but having a healthy watershed is fundamental to economic prosperity in Idaho, and creating that ecosystem where kids will stay here in Idaho. So that's my short answer. Pretty complex.
Thank you. Thank you. They'll be happy to hear that.
Governor, thank you for your time. You're welcome to stay with us through the rest of the day if you want, or I'm sure you have plenty on your agenda, but we appreciate your opening our summit.
I just got a couple things going on. So
yeah, certainly one or two. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, everybody, now we're going to transition. We get to hear from our local leadership. We're going to hear from the mayors. We're going to start with Mayor Judith Nissula. Mayor Nissula, if you don't mind going first, a native of Valley County and with the city of Cascade, after receiving her BBA from Boise State University, she continued with a 20-year career in banking. She's been active throughout the community and has served as a public servant and city P&Z commissioner, as a city council person, and now mayor. And so, Mayor Nissula, our question to you is, how would improving watershed water quality help our community?
Well, you know, the basic about water is that we all have to have it. And I think that in particular, how it's important to our community is between the lake and the river, we have a lot of use in those both of those bodies of water. It's not attractive to any of us to have a lake that gets the algae blooms on there, and it's not particularly pleasing to know that the water that's coming out of that lake is going through our city and the rest of our valley. So it would help overall from a health perspective. I think that there are unknowns out there as far as what not good water quality can lead to. And I think that we as good stewards of our natural resources need to do whatever each individual can do to help with that. And so education, and I hope that's one of the main things that come out of this is education to everyone of what they do. We do things every day, and while we drink water, and that's important to us, it's so much more than that. It's so much more to, we have a lot of people who want to have a more sustainable lifestyle, and through that you need water to water your garden and do all sorts of things with water that we need to think about and the importance of that. And as new people move into our area, I'll just share a little story. In particular, our city treasurer, she said she never gave a thought about where her water came from when she turned on the tap, and where the water went when she flushed the toilet. And she said, oh my gosh, I've learned so much of the importance of water and not taking it for granted. And we've got a long ways to go with that education to help all of us, like I said earlier, be better stewards to what we can for our community. And I think that it just goes without saying, you read stories and history stories and all over the nation that the water wars and whatnot. So certainly history tells us that water is very important to our communities and sustaining our communities. And we just need to keep pushing that message forward.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. So let's see, next we have Mayor Susan Dorris of Donnelly. Mayor Dorris, I'll do a quick introduction. Susan and her husband, George Dorris, moved to Donnelly in 1993. Susan was the first woman to hold a non-traditional position as district representative for Pacific Gas and Electric. The Dorrises are business owners in Donnelly, owning Flight of Fancy Bakery and Coffee House and GNS Aviation. Mayor Dorris is a mother and grandmother of 7. The future of Donnelly matters. Mayor Dorris, how would improving watershed water quality help the city of Donnelly? I'm going to ask you to unmute.
How about that?
Fantastic.
I'll correct the statement. I was not the first woman in a non-traditional job at the Gas and Electric. I was one of about 6 or 8 when they didn't call it diversity then, they called it non-traditional jobs. And that's what I did. Donnelly's kind of unique in this discussion. Both the cities of McCall and Cascade sit on the shores of their lakes. The city of Donnelly is approximately 2 miles east of Cascade Lake, and the city has no direct water flow into Cascade Lake, and we don't abut the lake at all. However, there are 2 drainage ditches that run through Donnelly. We have the east and the west drainage ditches. They both converge and they run into the Eld Tree Farm Pond. Eld's ponds provide an excellent secondary treatment facilities, and they remove sediments and phosphates. The water in the east and west drainage ditches is surface and subsurface runoff from the properties to the north of the city. Currently, the properties to our north are irrigated for cattle. However, as our valley continues to grow, a balance between ranching and new residences are going to be a challenge. If money wasn't an object, Donnelly has proposed a secondary holding pond downstream of the existing Eld Pond that would provide additional capacity for the drainage flowing from both the east and west drainage ditches. That was proposed back in 2006 for the Donnelly Transportation Plan. Our lakes are valuable assets for our communities. The rapid drawdown for irrigation during the summer promotes algae contaminant growth. The decline of the water quality has accelerated in the last 20 years. What have we changed? And I think that's our challenge. We as communities in Valley County must have a collaborative working relationship to create a healthy and safe environment for us to play in and for our visitors to play in. And we need to be able to raise our families in a quality environment. Each city has to deal with the runoff from all the tributaries and communities upstream of them, as well as their own contributions. The city of Donnelly, the businesses in Donnelly, and the Donnelly Chamber of Commerce all want the same things: clean, safe water for our community and businesses, a fun place for visitors and our families to play, and a plan for the future of our water system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mayor Dorris. Let's see, our next mayor is Mayor Bob Giles from McCall. He served 7 years in the McCall City Council, or has served. Previous career was with the USDA Forest Service in both Boise National Forest and Payette National Forest, As a National Resources Staff Officer, he oversaw soil and watersheds, timber sales and vegetation management, wildlife, fisheries, and range program areas. Our question to Mayor Giles is, why is clean water important to our unique community? And Mayor Giles, we've got about 4 minutes for you, just so you know. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Can everyone hear me all right?
We can.
This is Mayor Bob. I pronounced my last name Giles, and thanks for inviting me. It's really great to hear from our other mayors who I know quite well, and I appreciated hearing their comments. So thanks for inviting us and hearing our perspective. I'm going to give you 4 different perspectives from the city of McCall. I'll start with a citizen's perspective. First and foremost, our drinking water. It's really important to us. It's a surface water. Fortunately, because of good work that Idaho Department of Lands, private timberlands, and the National Forest System, the Payette National Forest, we're pretty fortunate that the quality of water is great coming out of Payette Lake. We don't have to spend a lot of money on purification, just simple filtration and a little bit of chlorine. So that's really important to all our citizens, our drinking water. Second perspective is comes from my past career. You mentioned I had worked with the Forest Service, both on the Boise National and the Payette National Forest. And one of the responsibilities I had was fisheries habitat and protecting water quality and wildlife habitat. Most of my friends enjoy fishing and hunting. And as the other 2 mayors talked about earlier, these things are all tied together. A healthy ecosystem, healthy fisheries, healthy wildlife, all depend upon clean water. As an outdoor and sports enthusiast, when I retired from the Forest Service, I had a lot of time to do things outside and really enjoy it. And all of my friends that are doing these kinds of activities have reminded me how important it is that water quality be maintained or improved in some cases. So for us up here in the headwaters, in addition to fishing and hunting, a lot of people enjoy motorized activities on Payette Lake. A lot of folks enjoy non-motorized activity, swimming, simple things like paddleboarding. All of these things we enjoy. We depend on clean water to have a great experience for us to connect to the outdoors. And the last perspective I'd like to share is as the mayor of McCall. As the mayor, the drinking water part, I mentioned how important that is, and it's a real cost in terms of the treatment. And the better the quality of water that we pump out of Payette Lake, the lower our cost and the less chemicals we have to introduce, and the better product that we can deliver. But it's also important to our manufacturers. Recently, I'll give you one example. Recently, as the good fortune of being in a resort town, a number of microbreweries have sprung up, and they're very high quality microbreweries, and they depend upon clean water that's fairly pure, so they don't have to do a lot of filtration before they manufacture their product. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to our moderator, and I guess my closing remarks are thanks for inviting us. A number of my staff are on this conference, and they will be participating in all 4 sessions. So thank you, Gary.
Thank you, sir. Again, it's been great to have all our local mayors share their perspective and kind of tie in the big viewpoint for each community, because we all are in this watershed together. I'm going to take a brief moment to screen share and show everybody the agenda for the rest of the meeting. So we'll take a few seconds on that, and please be patient. Okay, share. All right. So I just want to say fantastic timing to the mayors. We're doing great on sticking with our agenda. Up next, we're going to go to David Simmonds. David will run us through a brief history of the Cascade Reservoir and Big Payette Lake. And following that, we'll do historical lessons learned from Ken Roberts. And then I'll do another break and we'll go tag back into the agenda then. So stop my share. And also, so everyone knows that the agenda, a link to the agenda has been sent out through the Q&A, and you can find it on the Valley Soil Water Conservation District website as well. I'm going to do a brief introduction on David Simmonds. Let's see. David was a member of the original _ Big Payette Lake Water Quality Council from 1993 to 2004. David joined the reestablished council in 2019 after retirement and is now the president. He has worked on water quality and public land management issues in Idaho since the 1980s and served several terms on the board of the Idaho Conservation League. David, to you.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for the introduction, Gary. And on behalf of the Big Payette Lake Water Quality Council, thanks to everyone for taking an interest in the lakes and the watershed. Let me get my slides going here. And jump right in. Okay, quick word on who we are. And as you can see, contact information in the upper right-hand corner. Please check out our website. We've got lots of good information about Payette Lake there, and also about the University of Idaho study that we're currently helping to support. So when I was asked to do this today, the first thing I thought of was 1993. And when Davis's cows walked down to the reservoir and took a drink and keeled over dead. But because that's when it seemed like people really started taking an interest in water quality. And there's a much bigger picture though, and there's really two big lakes and a big watershed, and they have some things in common and some real differences. So I'll boil it down to three factors that set the stage for water quality: geology, climate, and people. Very simplistic diagram, but you know, this is just to help us get our heads around it. And you know, just help us see how the pieces fit together and how we got where we are today. So of course the geology came first, and this is the only comic relief we're going to get today. So there it is. But we need to go way back to see how we got where we are. And I don't know if anybody else remembers Mr. Peabody and Sherman from Bullwinkle, but that was one of my favorite shows. It makes me think about how important it is to look back and let history help us do the right thing. But I'm going to keep it very brief and oversimplified, so I hope you'll bear with me there. So how did we get a watershed in the first place? I'm going to cover 100 million years in about a minute and a half. So between 150 and 50 million years ago, the Farallon plate out in the Pacific wedged itself under the North American plate. and it pushed it up, which helps explain why we live in the mountains instead of at the beach. And the beach used to be just east of Riggins, by the way. This also caused some wrinkles here and there. So we have mostly north-south orientation of mountains and valleys. And in our local area, there's a feature called the Western Idaho Shear Zone. It runs from the Owyhees north up to around the Clearwater River. It's generally along West Mountain, and that helps shape the west side of Long Valley. So mostly just to our east, the Idaho batholith is a big plateau of granite that bubbled up about 80 million years ago from the one plate running under the other. And as we'll see, that granite does matter. So Long Valley is really the low spot between the batholith and West Mountain. And it's the smaller oval in the middle of the screen there, just in sort of context. You can see McCall's at the top, and Boise way down at the bottom for scale. So let's fast forward through the next 40 million years or so. And that was the time when the fault movement, erosion, and glaciers finished shaping and filling Long Valley. So climate is next, but it segues right into people. The ice ages came and went, and I said this would be quick. About 20,000 years ago, the final Pinedale glaciation of the last ice age wound down. And that was mostly seen in the north end of the watershed, where the Big Payette Lake and Little Payette Lakes formed behind natural dams, glacial moraines, and they are still there. The last 12,000 years were mostly a warm interglacial period when the watershed became more biologically productive and habitable. Columbian mammoths that had made themselves at home in the region died out, and native people found the valley a good place to hunt and fish in the summer. So people have been in the valley here for thousands of years. But let's jump to recent history now, from around 1850 to 1920, when Finnish immigrants, among others, moved in, and the sheep-eater Shoshone and the Nez Perce people were displaced. In 1911, a map of Long Valley looked pretty different than today. You can see on the right side of the screen, there was no Lake Cascade, there was no town of Cascade. Donnelly wasn't there yet. Roseberry was the big hub in the middle of the valley. So the Payette and Snake Rivers had no dams in those days, and sockeye salmon swam from the Pacific to Payette Lake to spawn. There was a commercial sockeye cannery at Lardo near the present Shore Lodge. In the 1890s, the water was clear enough to see 27 feet down. It's not as good today. DEQ says about 14 to 20 feet in deep water, and it was close to zero near shore during the 2020 algae bloom, according to one diver that we spoke to. So the railroad from Emmett to McCall started in 1914, which kicked off large-scale logging and summer tourism, along with livestock shipping. And it's fair to say that the railroad accelerated human impacts in the valley. So then dams were built for irrigation, storage, and flood control, starting with Big Payette Lake in 1920, Black Canyon and Little Payette Lake dams in 1924, then Cascade Dam from 1942 to 48, and finally Hells Canyon Complex in the 50s and 60s. As a result, all the salmon runs were cut off. By this point, the watershed was pretty different from any time in the last 10 to 20,000 years. The shallow Cascade Reservoir filled up over good soil with lots of nutrients, got more nutrients and sediment from erosion of granite soils in the watershed, You remember that batholith from 80 million years ago. From sewage effluent, agriculture, and a fish hatchery. Eutrophication, that is nutrient enrichment, plant and algae overgrowth, and oxygen depletion, quickly got started. In less than 50 years, toxic algae blooms began to kill cattle and fish. Well, that got our attention. This timeline for Cascade Lake covers a lot, but let's just say that studies were done and the lake was listed by EPA for failing to support beneficial uses under the Clean Water Act. Agencies and local people did and continue to do lots of projects to improve water quality. That's all good, but the lake is still eutrophic. It suffers from annual toxic algae blooms and public health advisories. Shoreline and upland erosion, water sports, development, nutrient recycling, and a warmer climate make for an uphill battle. So Payette Lake is a different kind of lake with a different story, but it hasn't been spared from human influence. The shoreline was built up with city streets and homes with septic systems. The lake was used as a mill pond while the watershed was logged. Lake studies in 1969, 1975, and 1982 showed oxygen deficits and near-shore bacterial pollution. The sewer district was organized, and the lakeshore sewer system was completed in the 1980s. But impacts and effects continued to be felt. And by the early 1990s, Peter Johnson convinced the Idaho legislature to create the Big Payette Lake Water Quality Council to study the lake and develop a management plan. That plan and its limited monitoring program are still in place. In 1994, 52% of the watershed burned in the Blackwell fire. Runoff from the burn hit the lake the following year, and algae blooms were spotted. Long-term monitoring shows some stability, but the data is limited. More data would help reveal whether the lake is sliding toward a eutrophic degraded state. The University of Idaho study to examine shoreline erosion and nutrient pollution began in 2020. Also during summer 2020, and likely in some prior years, there was a widespread nearshore algae bloom, along with turbidity, bad smell, and taste that really affected contact recreation and some private water systems. So it might be helpful to summarize what's similar and what's different about the two lakes. So let's take a quick look. I'm not going to read you that whole list, but somehow all of these factors tie into geology, climate, and people. But I do want to point out sort of the action items. The last 4 bullet points: low funding levels for water quality monitoring and studies, voluntary water quality measures that have had some success, but it's been limited. Leadership and education on freshwater ecosystems is needed at a higher level, I think, than we've had in the past. And we do have dated lake management plans that could use some updating. So there are a lot of differences between the lakes as well, and I'll touch on those briefly. The history, characteristics, and impacts for the two lakes diverge somewhat. Payette Lake, it's deep, it's old. It's been recognized as a resort recreation area since 1926 by the legislature. It's for, as Bob Giles noted, it's the public drinking water supply for anywhere from 3,000 to 20,000 residents and visitors. There are algae blooms that have been observed, but they're not well studied or understood the way that they perhaps are in Lake Cascade. And as I said, fire burned 52% of the watershed in 1994, and that was a pretty hot fire. The effects of that may linger in terms of particularly water temperatures. So another reason that we do need more monitoring. Lake Cascade is a shallow reservoir. It's about 20 miles long and it's only 73 years old. Has recurring incidents and health advisories with toxic blue-green algae blooms, also known as cyanobacteria. It does have major seasonal and irrigation storage lake level changes. It was designated as water quality limited with a TMDL, that's a pollution budget, by the EPA. And it does have significant impacts from agriculture. So where does that leave us? There are elephants in the room, and that I knew that mammoth would come in handy. But to be way too simplistic, the elephants in the room are geology, climate, and people. For geology, the watersheds are mostly erosive granite. The sediment and the nutrients go downhill. The lakes are at the bottom of the hill. For climate, it's the effects of a warming climate. We have changes in water temperature, quantity, and timing that are affecting the lakes. We've got more and bigger wildfires and changing vegetation in the watershed. And people, no offense to any person or elephant on this, but we're one of the elephants in the room. We build dams, we change the landscape, we put the watershed to work, and we play on the lakes. But we may use history and science to understand the facts and avoid repeating past mistakes. And we can choose to solve even very large water quality problems, or we could just give up. So with that, I will turn it back to Gary, and I want to thank you all for listening. I hope that was useful.
David, thank you very much. I appreciate the tie-in to the woolly mammoth in the room. I'll be sure to use that. We're going to go to Ken Roberts briefly for the audience. If you do have any questions, please post them in the Q&A. We're not using the hand raise function today for this meeting. So if you have any questions, just put it in the Q&A and we'll get to it. Ken, to you, thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Gary. I appreciate the opportunity to shed some insight today. I also appreciate David's comments about the geology and some of the background. I'll touch on some of that as well. First of all, I want to thank the Valley Soil and Water Conservation Districts. I noticed that the 150 people that are currently on the call, Paul Client, Justin Florence, and Art Troutner on there. These gentlemen and others have spent numerous hours volunteering to help in water quality stuff over many, many years. I will say lessons learned are is something that I will just share a quick story. Things that I've learned, experience has a way of teaching us about lessons. And I know from my experience in that legislature and whatnot that I wished I knew then what I know now. And I think that's something that we can all relate to when it comes to water quality issues in Lake Cascade and in Payette Lake. I look forward to working together with all of the stakeholders, improving water quality in the lakes. Agricultural definitely has its impacts on the reservoir. And I think you'll see that over time that agricultural actually is a friend to water quality in the Cascade Reservoir. And I'll try to talk about that briefly. So here's a few lessons learned. I wanted to share a presentation here. Okay. Gary, just quick questions. Can you see the screen okay?
We can, which is great.
Okay, great. So first of all, I think when we talk about historical lessons learned, there's a few things that really enter in, and I'm glad to hear David also talk about some of these things as well. Back up here. For some reason, I'm skipping on slides. I don't know what's going on. Well, let me back up. I'm going to just speak from my notes for a second, and then I'll catch up where that slide picks up. So a couple important things about history of Valley County. The soils, they're a highly fertile volcanic soils. They have incredible, what we call CEC capacity, cation exchange capacities, which store a lot of nutrients. They're primarily sandy loam soils. They're high in organic matter. They have a low pH, and prior to the electrification process of mining phosphate, similar to that they do down in Pocatello, the mineral apatite is a naturally occurring source of phosphorus, and there were actually intent on mining for that apatite in Valley County, especially in the Gold Fork area. So that results in a high background level for naturally occurring phosphorus. Another thing about the soils in Valley County are typically highly compacted, which restrict infiltration rates. A couple things about the valley and the mountains. As David previously said, it's a natural basin. There's a reason that Cascade has its name of Cascade. It was because of the cascading Payette as it crossed over the rocks near where the current Cascade Dam is. And so that naturally created a basin in the valley, even before Cascade Reservoir was created. So there are well-established stakeholders in this process. They involve timber, agricultural interests, communities that we've heard from the cities today. I'm glad to hear Judy Nissula say that you had a constituent that said, well, they didn't know exactly where their water came from, and they didn't know exactly where their water went when they flushed the toilet. So that's a knowledge base that I think that's important for us all to realize. We also have stakeholders in state and federal government. So here's back with my slides now. I think there's some just a little quick history about what happened in the 90s and early 2000s. The city of McCall was successful in creating the wastewater storage facility, land application with the J-Ditch project. North Lake Sewer and Water District was formed, had made improvements. You can see the improvements on the screen. Best management practices were identified and ranked by the Soil and Water Conservation District, which included but not limited to conversions to sprinkler irrigation, pump back projects, fencing of riparian areas, and creating buffer zones, and stock water development. So what works? And I guess I want to talk about some principles that have a history of success. So incentive-based best management practices are something that actually work quite well in Valley County. It's important, number one, I think that what we learned when I chaired the Cascade Reservoir Coordinating Council back in the 90s, that you have to prioritize best management practices. Voluntary participation is vital. It's much easier to incentivize those types of projects than it is to regulate them. Cost share percentages must motivate participation on private land. And what I mean by that is it has to have an economic viability to it. It must allow for landowners to participate and do the right thing. So there's, when it comes to those kind of projects, it takes a funding source. So what are some things we talk about for funding? So you have to access multiple sources. They can be individuals, the cities and counties, the state, the federal, and the federal has two partners in this. One is the Bureau of Reclamation, which we're going to hear from later today and in the next several weeks. The BPA, or Bonneville Power Administration, also is a funding source that can be tapped into. I think in regards to all of those, it's important to seek a dedicated funding source that's ongoing, or at least a multiple year commitment. Some other observations, and I think this is important. There's some of the water quality impacts in the area that are just the way it is. It's the background levels of phosphorus that occur naturally in the soils. It's the soil characteristics, and it's also spring runoff. I'm sorry, but when there's 2 or 3 or 4 feet of snow on the valley floor and it warms up in the spring and March, there's not a lot of potential things that we can do. Those are just things the way it is. However, there are things that we can do and that we can make changes. We need to always keep in mind, I think something that we learned in the initial round of this is there's a diminishing returns is in play. You can spend millions and millions of dollars, but we really ought to go after the ones that have the best return first. Agricultural and forestry production are beneficial by removing nutrients. I said I would talk about this briefly. Every truckload of hay or grain that we ship out of our farm takes with it phosphorus. Every load of cattle that's moved out of Valley County takes with it phosphorus, because those plants and those animals retain phosphorus in their bodies. They are helpful in the removal of phosphorus. However, there are projects and BMPs that should be balanced and implemented. And we must be mindful of balancing the economic needs of various industries and businesses with water quality improvement efforts. Make it affordable so people will get behind those programs and participate. Here's a couple ideas that we talked about in the mid-90s. We think at the time, we thought at the time had great potential. Stilling basins or impoundments work very well to catch or still out phosphorus. Some of the large scale projects that could have huge benefit with a reasonable cost are the Lake Fork Creek, the Gold Fork River, and the Payette River. What do we mean by those? We talked significantly about these in the mid-90s, about creating a stilling basin. I'll just use one of them, for example, on the Lake Fork Creek. Where the S Bridge is, west of Donley, there's a dike that runs across the reservoir that the road is built on the top of. If the reservoir could create an impoundment at basically full height to the north of that S Bridge, you then create a basin for those nutrients to settle out in. DEQ and the Soil and Water Conservation District back in March 20th of 1995, and I'll just read quickly. Wastewater passing through ponds has shown a 67% reduction in phosphorus and a 37% reduction in nitrates. That practice was instituted by my dad on our farm back in the 90s. Some small scale ponds, private ponds, also have that same potential. Some summer runoff pump back systems are highly effective as well. There's opportunities on Boulder Creek, Mud Creek, and Willow Creek. That water can be captured during the summertime where it's highly concentrated and pumped back into either canal systems or land applied for irrigation. Conversions of irrigation from flood or furrow irrigation to sprinkler irrigation also have great impacts or great improvements to phosphorus. Fencing livestock off the lake is important. However, you need to develop stock water locations so that the stock do have a water source. And I think reasonable setbacks are appropriate as well. Not huge distances, but a reasonable distance. The new 4828, those of you that have been around Cascade, Lake Cascade for a while understand that that's the elevation when it's in full pool. There was an addition built on the top of the radial gates in Cascade. If you ever go there and look at it, you'll see about a 1-foot extension. It was a splash dam extension. That's caused new creation of erosion around the reservoir. It might be a management thing that would be addressed with the Bureau of Reclamation. And I think it's also brought up, I think Susan Dorris brought this up about the drawdowns. We could look at it and explore alternatives to the summertime flow augmentation for the salmon flush. There's also a component there with Idaho Power and backfilling water on the Brownlee Reservoir. So collaboration is the key. Identify and invite all stakeholders, both private, public, and the utilities to the discussions. Competing interests can work successfully together if there's a common goal. And I think it's important to always work towards an attitude of yes, if, and then I think we can get some things done. Appreciate the opportunity to share for a moment today, and look forward to the future discussions and participation from the agricultural industry.
Excellent. Thank you very much for sharing, Ken. We appreciate the historical perspective. We're going to transition now. I do have a quick announcement. People are asking, where can we get these great slideshows that our panelists are sharing? And so everyone, I want you to know that we're asking the panelists to turn their slideshows into us, or a copy of them, and we'll put them into a PDF and try to make them available on the Valley Soil and Water District, Conservation District website. And also we're recording this summit, and so we'll be posting sections of the summit down the road on social media. That's our plan. We're going to transition now to Chase Cusack. Chase is a Watershed water quality analyst. Chase, I'm going to give you a brief intro. With the Idaho Department of Environmental Quality in Boise, and is a native of the Boise area. He has a BA in Environmental Studies from Boise State and an MS in Environmental Science and Management from Idaho State University. Chase is currently our Watershed lead contact and focused on water quality monitoring and management in our North Fork Payette River watershed. Chase, take it away. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Gary. Can you guys hear me all right? Okay.
Yes, I can.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me. Thanks for everyone for being here, and the organizers of this. Thanks for putting it together. I'm going to dive into it because I have been given the task of finishing by 11:25, and I'm going to try to do it. Let me share this real quick. Okay. That pop up all right? Looks good? Okay. All right, so I'm going to go through a few things today. This is going to be some things that have occurred in the last few years, but basically we're going to be covering the North Fork Payette monitoring that occurred in 2019. We're going to look at Cascade Reservoir monitoring and cyanobacteria issues, and then we'll get into some of the most recent Payette Lake monitoring as well. So just to start, I wanted to review, and I won't spend too much time on this, but I wanted to review the 5-year review that was released in 2018 by DEQ. And this was a review of the original TMDL that focused primarily on tributaries to Cascade Reservoir. Basically what I wanted to show everyone is that, some of the issues that we're dealing with primarily here are going to be total phosphorus, or TP, and sediment issues coming from the tributaries. There is a total phosphorus and pH TMDL currently on the reservoir. So you can see how that relates to the tributaries coming in. And I'll go over this briefly. 1996 and 99 is when the original TMDL phases came out. 2009 Water Quality Management Plan. 2011 was that tributary TMDL addendum, and then finally that 5-year review that was for those tributaries in 2018. So some of the water quality targets that are highlighted in those documents: total phosphorus at 0.025 milligrams per liter, chlorophyll A, dissolved oxygen. These are all things that we look at primarily in those. Same goes with the tributaries to Cascade Reservoir with those TP or total phosphorus numbers. We're trying to meet that same target that's set in the reservoir. So that original TMDL called for a 37% reduction of total phosphorus from the tributaries. And then as far as the sediment goes, anywhere from 47 to 83% reduction of sediment with a target of 80% bank stability in those tributaries. So just to give you an overlook of the data itself, this is data that's been collected since early 1990s, and basically what this shows is our chlorophyll A concentrations. You know, that's somewhat of a success story. We've seen a pretty good decrease in chlorophyll A in Cascade Reservoir since the early 90s. However, the real issue now is that those total phosphorus concentrations, we saw a decrease early on, and then at that point it kind of plateaued, and we haven't seen much of a decrease since. So that's going to continue to be a focus for Cascade Reservoir, is looking at those total phosphorus concentrations. And then this is for the tributaries. And again, this comes out of that 5-year review, which is available on our website if you want to delve a little further into it. But what this is showing us is those total phosphorus concentrations coming out of the tributaries are still quite high. And so that's something that, and this has been mentioned a couple times, but that's something that I think can be a primary focus for this watershed as far as reducing total phosphorus, is looking into those tributaries and finding ways to decrease phosphorus inputs to those, and ultimately decreasing phosphorus concentrations in the reservoir itself. As far as sediment goes, that bank cover, that target cover that we set was 80% for the tributaries. You can see that for the most part, we're looking at Gold Fork, Mud Creek, and Boulder Creek. We're very close to those percentages. There's a couple areas that certainly could use some attention, but we're very close on that matter. So that's good news. And then that bottom graph is just giving us an idea of estimated sediment loads in tons per day to the reservoir itself. So, you know, again, the importance of sediment essentially is directly correlated with that total phosphorus, where a lot of times you have phosphorus that is bonded to the sediment. And so if you have a pulse of sediment moving into the reservoir, it's likely you'll see a pulse of phosphorus moving into the reservoir as well. Okay, so that kind of brings us up to speed a little bit. This is a 2019 study that DEQ and Bureau of Reclamation collaborated on. And what we were doing is we wanted to look at current reservoir data, and we also wanted to look at the North Fork Payette, because this is a water body that we have not spent a lot of time collecting data for. And so that was something we wanted to do. The North Fork Payette additionally was listed in our 303D in need of a TMDL. And so, and it was originally listed for biota or habitat bioassessment, which essentially tells us that there's something occurring in there that isn't right, but we don't know exactly what it is. So that gives us kind of a reason to go in and see if we can try to figure that out. So what we did is we looked at the nutrients in the river, we looked at the temperature, we looked at E. coli, and we looked at sediment. So this is the results that we got. Essentially, with the North Fork Payette, we saw that red line for dissolved oxygen is set at 6 milligrams per liter, and that's the target that we're looking for. And for the most part, you can see that dissolved oxygen is above that, and that's good. We don't really see much of an issue with dissolved oxygen in there. And then the specific conductivity is another measure that we take, although I'm not going to cover it much because it's not too important in this situation. I want to make sure that we have enough time for everything. E. coli, again, those numbers came back really low, which is good for us to see, because that is a source of primary recreation there, and so that was good news there. Same with pH falling within the expected range for pH in that river. So the sediment, what you'll see from these graphs, basically what we're seeing, and that blue line is going to be the flow for that, basically a hydrograph for that sampling period. But what we're seeing, and this is expected, but you're seeing higher sediments being transported through that system into Cascade Reservoir in the early spring. And so that does make sense with the larger flows. Typically, you can see that sediment transport drops off significantly as the flow drops off. But we're still getting pretty high average loads of TSS, and a lot of that stuff probably does settle out there in the bottom part of the North Fork Payette before it enters Cascade Reservoir. At least the sandy sediments do, but some of those finer sediments likely do make it into the reservoir itself. So as far as the nutrient goes, we looked at total kilodal nitrogen, and we looked at total phosphorus. I'm mostly going to focus on the phosphorus. Again, we looked at that target that was set for the reservoir at 0.025 milligrams per liter, and what we found is that we're pretty well below that coming out of North Fork Payette River. And so that's good news, because that indicates that it's probably not a major source of TP to Cascade Reservoir. And you'll see with that North Fork Payette Site 3, which is actually the highest up near the fish hatchery in McCall. What we're seeing there is that there's really very little to no phosphorus coming out of the lake itself. And so likely much of that phosphorus is picked up somewhere between that site and in the bottom of the and then the mouth of the river into the reservoir. So but overall, the message here is we don't have a significant amount of TP coming out of North Fork Payette River, and so that's good news. That's good data for us to have. Temperature data that we got, we had 3 temperature loggers, and so one again is up at the top. We have one somewhere in the middle near I believe it's called Hat Ranch, and then we have one down below off Smiley Bridge. So what we're looking at here is kind of tough to decipher, but basically what it's showing us is again, the blue line being the flow or discharge through the sampling season, and we see those cooler temperatures early on in the season, and we see an increase through the summer. And interestingly enough, we're actually seeing higher temperatures in some cases coming out of the lake than we're seeing at the very bottom of the river into the Cascade Reservoir. And we'll discuss that a little bit more here coming up. This will give you a better idea of the location of these. And those lines on the graphs are some of our criteria that we've set, and I'll show you a table here in a second that'll highlight that a little bit better. But this just gives you a little bit of a layout of where those temperatures were collected. So this is a lot of data in one spot, but what I want you guys to focus on is those bottom 4 rows where we're looking at our actual criteria. So we have that cold water exceedance of 22 degrees Celsius and 19 degrees Celsius. And then the other thing we were looking at is the salmonid spawning criteria, and we have that 13 and 9 degrees Celsius. And a lot of those are seasonal. So what it's showing us is that there's an exceedance a significant percentage of the time throughout the sampling season. And we really didn't see much else out of that tributary as far as issues with the river. And so this is really the only thing that stood out. And ultimately what this led to is we switched that AU listing from that combined biota to a temperature listing based off of this information. And so ultimately this will need a temperature TMDL in the future, something to look at. And again, likely, the causes are we're seeing a lot higher temperatures in the middle of the season when the flows are extremely low. We're seeing somewhat warmer temperatures coming out of Payette Lake, and that could be due to how shallow the area where the water's coming out of the lake is, and how much heat it's gaining from sitting in that shallow area. But then the river itself, with the cooler temperatures towards the bottom, that's an indication that possibly seeing warming occurring at the top due to the shallowness of the river. And then once we get to that bottom section where there's a lot more deep pools in the river, a little bit of cooling occurs before it reaches Cascade Reservoir. So that gives you kind of a breakdown longitudinally of the river, what we found. And if you hadn't heard that it had been listed for temperature, that'll kind of give you an indication as why that happened. So with that, I'll move down river a little bit into Cascade Reservoir, and this is the monitoring that was done at the same time as that river data was collected. And so again, we're looking at pH and phosphorus, total phosphorus, and but we looked at a few things on top of that: temperature, conductivity, phycocyanin, which is a pigment similar to chlorophyll A, but it's specific to cyanobacteria. So it's a good indication of presence of cyanobacteria for us. We also looked at chlorophyll A and then dissolved oxygen. And our sites that we're monitoring are these, I call it the arms monitoring, which is kind of supposed to represent collaboration of all the arms at that point. We have the Sugarloaf monitoring right off Sugarloaf Island, and then monitoring down near the dam. So what we saw, and this is in the arms, this is at the arms site when we're looking at dissolved oxygen, the way that these are read, and they're kind of tricky, basically the top of the graph is the zero depth, so the surface of the water. Bottom of the graph is going to be the deepest point that was measured. And so if you're looking at these, if you're trying to read these graphs, basically when we look at June, early spring, we don't see a lot of change in a lot of things except for temperature, which is expected. That's time of the year that we might be seeing the lake, if it's turning over at all, if the water is mixing at all, could be occurring. So we may see consistency throughout the water column. But other than that, when we're looking at oxygen or phycocyanin, one thing that we did find that was interesting is that those phycocyanin numbers early on in the spring and late in the fall were much higher at depth. So what that tells us is that potentially those cyanobacteria that we see emerge in summertime at the surface are likely available and still abundant at depth in the reservoir. They don't always need sunlight, and they can lie dormant for a while, and they likely get a lot of their nutrients from the soils and the lake bed. So this is an interesting thing to find, and we saw that for the most part in all at all sites. So, but this gives you an idea of how things vary throughout the season.
So Chase, can I interrupt your flow for a second?
Yeah.
We have a question. People are curious, what is a TMDL?
What is a TMDL?
Correct.
Yeah, so TMDL stands for total maximum daily load. And essentially what it does is it establishes target loads for both non-point and point sources within the watershed. So we can look at things like tributaries. We can look at things like point sources would be something like a wastewater treatment facility, something like that. So we look at those and we calculate what an estimated load from those sources would be, and then we set a target to try to meet water quality standards that are set in the state of Idaho. So a lot of times with non-point sources, we address those issues with BMPs or best management practices, and then with the point sources, those are more regulated sites, and that's something that our pollutant discharge elimination system program deals with, setting criteria for those specific points of what they can discharge into the water. So the TMDL overall is it's a breakdown of the subbasin. It's a history of the subbasin. It's a history of land use and whatnot. And then the big part of that is the actual calculation of non-point source and point source loads and what's allocated to each. And then, yeah, is that all right?
Yeah, I think that's
Okay.
what we needed to know. That was the
Okay.
burning question. So yeah,
Okay.
I'll let you get back to it. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So let's go look at some of. So again, this is the ARM site. This is probably this is the shallowest site that we looked at. And then so this is Sugarloaf here. So again, we see in the early spring, we see kind of a consistency in dissolved oxygen and temperature and phycocyanin. It's really once that summer temperatures hit, the water begins to warm at the surface and cooler at the depth, which is expected. But again, we see the interesting thing that we see is that phycocyanin being more abundant at depth. In this case, down near, in October, down near 8 meters below the surface. So that's an interesting find, because what it tells us is, again, the cyanobacteria is likely in the water at all times. It just, we don't know what depth it's living at. And so this phycocyanin allows us to maybe try to find some of those patches of where that stuff is living. So, and then this is the data down near the dam, and we see really expected data out of the temperature readings down there throughout the season. Dissolved oxygen in this site is a little bit more inconsistent. We're seeing basically anoxic conditions in some months as shallow as 8 meters down. And then the phycocyanin at the dam, again, showing the same thing, much higher abundance in some of those months down at depth, and then we're seeing at the surface. The interesting thing about that is some of the surface readings, even during the bloom, were much lower than some of the readings that we were getting at depth. So it's the phycocyanin is still something new that we're trying. It's nothing that we use in the TMDL right now. It's more for our own information and trying to build that data set. So that's something we'll look into a little bit further in the future as we collect more data. But okay, so the things that I wanted to point out with this, though, is total phosphorus. And again, that target is hard to see in there, but it's a light red line for total phosphorus. So what we're seeing is a lot through the tail end of the season, we're seeing an exceedance in that total phosphorus target. In some cases, a pretty significant exceedance. So that tells us that it's something that we still need to look into. That's still something that we need to continue working on. That total phosphorus is likely a major contributor to the abundance of cyanobacteria in the reservoir. And then the chlorophyll A numbers down here are well correlated, I guess, with the end of season being the more concerning point for Cascade Reservoir, as far as seeing higher nutrient levels, warmer water temperatures, and ultimately more growth of both algae and blue-green algae. So this just builds off of the graphs that we saw earlier, and I just want to cover them real quick. The story here is that we were looking at these declines and a plateau in TP. The 2019 data actually indicates that we may be on the way up again. And so we were unable to collect data in 2020. I don't know what that second part of that looks like, but it'll be something that we'll want to look at further if we get out there and sample this again. It'll be important to keep an eye on those lines and see if they are continuing to increase, or if that was just a hiccup in the season that we sampled. Okay, so I'm going to kind of skip over this, but basically what it says is as when we go forward, establishing trend analysis, more monitoring, things like that, and then WAG consultation as well. And I think more of that will get covered throughout this this summit. So, and then we'll go over Cascade Reservoir cyanobacteria blooms. 2019, I'm going to skip the history because I think some of that got covered. But we're definitely getting a lot more reports in recent years. And I just want to remind people that this is something that's relevant in all 6 Idaho DEQ regions. It's all over the state. It's also a national global issue. Everyone across the country is dealing with this right now. And so, it doesn't make it better, but it hopefully at least makes you feel less, not less special, but hopefully it makes you feel like you're not alone in this. This is a fight that everyone's putting up with. So I'm going to skip the toxins. This is just a breakdown of the toxins. If you want to look those 2 toxins up, they're the ones that we focus on primarily. So basically in Idaho, we have 2 criteria in place for putting out health advisories. One is if we detect toxin, microcystin toxin greater than 4 parts per billion, or cylindrospermopsin toxin greater than 8 parts per billion. The other criteria in place is actually cell enumeration, or the population density of cells. So how many cells are in a milliliter of water. So we have these 2 criteria in place to help us decide whether or not an health advisory needs to be issued. In 2019, we had no toxin the times that we sampled in the water, but we did have a large density of cells in the water at the time, and so that's why that advisory was issued. In 2020, we saw a bloom again. This gives you a small timeline. 2020 in June, we started getting our first reports, which has actually become pretty typical for Cascade Reservoir. It kind of is a long drawn out bloom where it really starts to take off in late September, early September to late September. So this year, we actually did get a pretty significant toxin reading of greater than 40 parts per billion. And so again, I want to remind you that criteria was set at 4 parts per billion, and we got a reading of 40. And so, more than 10 times what the human health criteria is for the state. And so ultimately, that's why that advisory goes in. And if you have more questions about advisory, the advisory process, I'm happy to answer that, and I'll provide my contact at the end of this. But and then this is just a photo by the dam. I'm sure a lot of you in the area, this is familiar to you. So that was taken in October of 2020, around the time that the advisory was issued. So DEQ collaborates on this with a lot of different agencies, and I'd encourage you to look into some of these and how they're dealing with it. But basically, this is just a breakdown of all the people involved with the bloom monitoring. And again, I'm going to kind of just breeze through it so we can try to finish on time. I know that I'm already a little over, but this brings us to Big Payette Lake. And so this is data that was collected between 2019 and 2020. Our sampling points for Payette Lake, we have some down in that western part of the lake, that very northern part of the lake, and then down in Pilgrims Bay in the southeastern section. And these sites were set a long time ago when the monitoring plan was established. And ultimately, they kind of cover the deepest parts of the lake. And so we have 4 objectives that we're looking at. We're looking at minimum dissolved oxygen, mean dissolved oxygen, and median total phosphorus. So that's 3 objectives. And I'll go over those with a little more detail. Just to give you a brief idea of the sampling that we do full depth water column profiles for temperature, specific conductance, pH, and dissolved oxygen. We do epilimnion sampling, which is kind of that upper portion of the lake that is accessible to the light. And then we do sampling down in the hypolimnion. And for the most part, we collect the same information out of both. The only difference is in the deep parts of the lake, we do not collect chlorophyll A because we don't expect to see it down there in high numbers. So to go through some of the data, again, objective 1, we're looking at concentrations of dissolved oxygen between June and September being greater than 6 milligrams per liter. And that's between the surface and 61.5 meters at all times in the Southwest Basin. So these are very specific targets that we're trying to hit here. But basically what this shows is that the objective for this has been met pretty consistently since 2011. So that's good news for us. And I'll go over the 2020 data here shortly. Objective 2, we're looking at average dissolved oxygen through that time period being greater than 3 milligrams per liter. And what this is showing us as well is that those objectives were met through 2018 and 19. And then for the most part, since 1997, that objective has been met with exception to a couple years in 1998 and 2000. So the 2020 data, what that's showing us is that so that objective was met in 2020, and then however the mean DO for the hypolimnion was not met in 2020. It was actually greater than 3.0 milligrams per liter. And then the objective 3, median TP and epilimnion, so that's less than 6 milligrams per liter for total phosphorus. In 2018 and 19, the objectives were met at all times. Since 1997, the objectives are met for the most part on a regular basis. We did see exceedances at multiple sites in a few of those years. And then one thing to note is that we actually, so this objective is set for the epilimnion, but we actually see higher TP values 18% of the time in the lower portion of the lake, the hypolimnion. But we don't have an objective set for that right now. So, and this is just a graph to show you those years that was exceeded, with the blue line being the target. And that is the median total phosphorus for that same. And again, that only the only time it exceeded that objective was in 2014. Other than that, we've met that objective. And then this is for the median total phosphorus. And again, we see that criteria not being met in a few years, but for the most part, it is met. And that's the median total phosphorus. And I wish I could have spent more time on this, and I apologize. But again, I'll provide my contact afterwards. You guys are welcome to email me, and I'm happy to have a discussion with you. And then this is a total 2020 data. I do want to focus on this for just a second because, as mentioned before, we saw a few things happen in Payette Lake this year that are not what the locals would call normal. And so what we did see is we did see an exceedance in TP in multiple sites this year. And so that could be, one explanation for the algal growth that we saw this year. And then the other thing that we've seen in the last couple of years is that our chlorophyll A numbers in the lake are increasing a little bit. And so they're still quite low, but that's one thing to keep an eye on as well.
Hey, Chase, this is Gary. I'm sorry to interrupt your flow, but
it's all right.
You simply know too much.
I know.
You know too much. We've got we also have a lot of questions that have been stacking up in the Q&A. So if you can make yourself available and share your work email, I think it'd be great for people to reach out to you and get those questions answered. Yeah,
I can do that. Not a problem.
Awesome. Well, is there any, I'll give you one last statement.
How about I just throw up my contact, and anyone that has a question can contact me. And I'm happy to share this PowerPoint as well. So if people want to look through it, they can do that as well.
I think that'll be very informative. And I think if you're available, we'll probably get you into future summits, and we'll definitely give you a little more time. So
yeah, sorry about that. There's a lot of years to cover in 30 minutes or so.
Right. It's a tight turnaround. So thank you for doing it. And we appreciate your expertise.
Yeah.
Okay, we're gonna head over to Jordon Messner. Jordon is gonna talk about the status of our local fishery and how fisheries management and water quality go hand in hand. Quick intro on Jordon. I received his BS from Humboldt State University in 2009 and the Master of Science from the University of Alberta in 2011. He started his career with Idaho Fish and Game in 2005 and is now the Regional Fisheries Manager for the McCall region. Jordon is an avid hunter, angler, and outdoorsman and spends a substantial amount of time on Lake Cascade each year fishing. Jordon, take it away and thank you.
All right, thanks. Unfortunately, it looks like the ratio on my presentation might be a little off, so I apologize if things got cut off here. But what I really wanted to highlight mostly are just some of the things that I think will benefit both the fisheries and water quality. And I really appreciate both the governor and the mayors talking about the importance of the local fisheries and how water quality and fisheries go hand in hand, as well as kind of Chase talking about the temperature issues we're dealing with and the relationship between discharge and temperature, because I'm going to go into that some. So how are fisheries, I'm going to go over how are fisheries management and water quality related. I'll go over some of the previous management activities, fisheries management activities at Cascade, a little brief history, what our current fisheries management goals, objectives, and plans are. And then mostly I want to hit home on some of the things that can be done to improve both fisheries quality and water quality together. So how are fisheries management and water quality related? I mean, first of all, anglers are huge advocates and conservationists. A lot of license dollars goes back into conservation, and as well as the federal excise tax that's put on hunting and fishing goods goes back into conservation. So that's one big one. Managing a balanced fishery helps to maintain proper food web balance. So the way that works is top-down ecological control, having predators that then keep your planktivorous fish in check, can then work out to help balance the fishery and minimize algal blooms in some cases. It's just all that balance. Reduced water quantity has adverse effects on both water quality and fisheries quality. And that's something I'm going to hit on at the end. And then also increased average annual temperatures expected over the foreseeable future are likely to adversely affect both. And so these two things are what I'm going to hit on at the end on kind of some ideas for how we can improve both fisheries and water quality together. So again, a little brief background of the fisheries management in Cascade or in the basin. The dam was built in the 40s. From 1947 to 1999, I'll just give a brief rundown here. So it was an excellent trout fishery right after the dam was built, right after the reservoir was built, until about 1958, when northern pike minnow became the dominant fish biomass in the reservoir. Just a little side note, yellow perch were first observed in 1957. They actually came out of Payette Lake. We stocked them in Payette in 1922, and they swam down when Cascade Reservoir was built. We chemically treated the tributaries of Cascade on a couple of different occasions, 1958 to 62, and then again 68 to 74. And that was to reduce pike minnow and sucker abundance so that we could improve game fish survival. So the 1980s through 1990s, Cascade was an extremely popular perch and salmonid fishery, kind of, just riding on the backs of those chemical treatments in the earlier years. There was a threefold effort increase from the 1970s to the 1980s and 90s, corresponding to the improvement in fisheries quality. And in 1992, that fishery was valued at $9.3 million. So pretty soon after that, about mid-90s, we saw a sharp decline in perch and trout abundance, which ended up being pretty much a total collapse of game fish by the early 2000s. Pike minnow dominated the fishery again by 1999, and we estimated an economic value lost from the 1992 era to early 2000s of about $6 million. So this is looking at we go out and do surveys every year, counting boats and shore anglers during holiday periods, and then we average those counts together to come up with like a mean index of angler effort from year to year. So this is kind of showing you, like, again, 1992 is when the fishery was was really kind of booming. And by the early 2000s, corresponding with that kind of collapse of the sport fishery, you see the angler effort reduced dramatically as well. So corresponding to that collapse, 1999 to 2001, we had a graduate student and a professor at U of I investigate causes behind the fishery decline. And what they found was that we had an abundant pike minnow population that was dominated by large mature individuals. And that resulted in virtually zero perch recruitment. So you can see our size structure at that time. We weren't getting any perch over, 4 inches recruiting into the fishery. And the reason for that, it was assumed, was because we just had a really abundant population of large mature pike minnow, and they were consuming the majority of those perch and not letting them get to a size large enough that they could have increased survival and grow to adulthood. So what we did about that was 2004 to 2006, we implemented a large-scale restoration project where we went in and suppressed and removed nearly 30,000 pike minnow, and we stocked over 860,000 perch into the fishery. And so there you can see kind of the difference in length frequencies or size structure between perch in 2003 to 2005, and same thing with pike minnow from 2003 to 2005. Really hitting those adult pike minnow hard and stock and perch at the same time resulted in less predation and greater survival for perch. And we're kind of riding on that train now in terms of the success of the perch fishery. Since 2006, we've had 3 new state record perch, 2 world records, and as everyone here knows, it's become a very popular fishery with people coming from all over the country to enjoy it. And we've seen a corresponding increase in our angler effort as a result. So what has the perch population done since 2012? We've seen our abundance in perch decline pretty steadily since that time. The reason for that being, so the graph that's kind of on your left there is showing length frequency, or what size structure of our perch population look like in these different years. And you can see that because we've been dominated by mostly these really large perch individuals, and we've got predation by other organisms as well in the lake, we just really haven't been seeing any recruitment of juvenile perch past that 8-inch line for several years. And so our perch abundance has been declining as a result. In 2020, fortunately, we started seeing a little bit of an uptick in perch abundance, and we're seeing a little bit greater survival of or recruitment of perch, making it to that 8-inch and above size range. But unfortunately, we're also seeing our northern pike minnow population not so much increase in abundance, but we're seeing more and more mature individuals. And so that 2020 graph, or the 2020 line up on top of the left graph there, you can kind of see that our pike minnow population is becoming increasingly more mature. And on the graph on the right, you can see that the mean catch per site of large pike minnow has increased to almost above that dotted line, which is the index that the threshold we have listed in our commission approved fish management plan for when we're going to initiate pike minnow suppression efforts on the tributaries again. And so this year, spring 2021, we have plans in place to start working on the North Fork Payette River again to reduce pike minnow biomass and try to help restore some balance to the fishery. So our fisheries management objectives, again, what I just said, try to restore balance to the fishery, which will increase angling value and promote healthy food web interactions. This is just a note down here I thought was interesting as I was kind of combing through the literature. I found several studies that reported that a reduction in cyprinid biomass, which northern pike minnow are, has been proven effective as a biomanipulation measure to increase abundance of zooplankton grazers, which thereby reduces algal blooms. And I'm not saying that's going to happen in Cascade, but I think this is a really interesting opportunity with the amount of monitoring that we have going on that we've just been talking about with DEQ and Fish and Game's efforts to kind of get everybody on board with, I guess, studying the effects of our suppression efforts on the water quality and the entire food web. And doing that right would probably be like 2 PhDs, but we'll have to see what we can bring together to work on. So what else? This is kind of what I wanted to hit home with. What else can we do to improve water quality and fisheries quality at the same time? And I think the big one is try to increase water quantity and reduce temperature anywhere we can. So I'll just briefly go over some of those things. The effects, obviously, of low flow and increased temperature. We have reduced recruitment and survival for trout and tributaries. Some of those graphs that Chase showed temperatures that are well outside the thermal optima of salmonids. Even in Cascade Reservoir, we're dealing with temperatures that are, approaching the thermal optima or thermal max for some salmonids. And I think the feasibility of maintaining long-term salmonid fisheries in Cascade is low if we don't figure out a way to get some colder water in there. Increased temperatures result in decreased dissolved oxygen concentration, can lead to fish kills, and those toxin-producing cyanobacteria thrive under increased temperatures and low DO. This is a graph showing, well, Chase already went through that, so I'm going to skip that. So how might we increase flow and decrease temperature? These are some of the things that I just wanted to throw out for ideas for the group. Increasing flow. Ken Roberts talked about some of these things. Water savings through improved irrigation system efficiency, like pivots and sprinklers. So you can let the water stay in the creek for longer, pump it out from a lower diversion point, and bring up the water that people need on their fields rather than flood irrigating and running everything through long canals where it warms up. Accountability of water usage in the basin. I think as we see more development, we start seeing more like domestic level use, maybe even non-permitted domestic level use. We might think about trying to track down, what the impacts of that is. Increased storage capacity is a really interesting one. I basically tracked down some information from our irrigator here, Ron Shirtliff, that Payette Lake is capable of holding water about 1.5 feet higher than it currently holds. However, it would flood private land if we were to hold it at that level. But Ron was confident if we were able to get increased storage capacity or hold Payette Lake at the level that it was meant to hold, at the 8-foot level, that we would be able to increase flow substantially, probably 3-fold throughout the summer period when we're dealing with really low flow and really high temperature in the North Fork Payette. And then I guess I'll just skip to kind of this last one, the graph there at the bottom. This is picturing hypolimnetic withdrawal, which basically the idea there is rather than taking surface water off of Payette Lake, you take water from below the thermocline where it's 10, 15 degrees colder than that surface water. And we actually do that in Payette Lake right now. That's how the hatchery operates when surface temperatures are too high to raise fish at the McCall hatchery. They're pumping water out from 50 feet down in Payette Lake to get colder water into the hatchery inflow. And this is something that, would take a substantial amount of money, but could be done to get colder water into the North Fork Payette. This is my last slide, and I guess I just wanted to, give kudos to this group and the organizers and just say, I think as long as we continue collaborating and communicating and focusing on common goals, everybody staying open-minded, bringing creative ideas to the table, building relationships and sharing information freely, I think we'll be able to move forward and get something done. But I think it's just really important for us all to, realize that as long as we focus on those common goals like we're doing here, we'll be able to get a lot more good stuff done. So that's it for me.
Jordon, thank you so much. I want Jordon to know, and the other presenters, as we've had questions come into the Q&A column, if you can just take a peek in there, you might have time to answer them today. If you have any questions about how to do that, Gina is sending out some guided information for our panelists. Great. So our next presenter is Rich Jackson. Rich is the USBR Watershed Management, or he's going to talk about USBR watershed management issues and opportunities at Cascade Reservoir. Rich received a PhD from the University of Wyoming in 2009. He began federal service with the BLM at the Marsing Field Office in 2007 as their riparian and water quality specialist. Then he was hired by the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation in 2013, working for the Snake River Area Office Environmental Compliance Group, and is now our lead contact for Lake Cascade. Rich, are you here to join us today?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
Right.
Oh, let me find my presentation. Can everybody see my presentation by chance? How about now?
Looks great, Rich.
Fantastic. Well, fantastic. Good afternoon almost to everyone. My name is Rich Jackson. I work for Bureau of Reclamation. I'm a natural resource specialist, and I work primarily in environmental compliance and water quality. Today, we're going to talk about Cascade Reservoir and some of Reclamation's watershed management issues and opportunities. So some quick facts. Cascade Dam was constructed in 1946. It's a zone earth-filled dam. Initial storage capacity is around 703,000 acre feet, which is about 653,000 acre feet of active space meaning usable space. And in 1995, from a reclamation sediment survey, they estimated total capacity had decreased down to 693,000 acre feet, about 646,000 acre feet of active space. So we had a little bit of sedimentation. The big picture on this is that that's not a lot of sedimentation comparatively, but there is sedimentation going on like occurs at most reservoirs. Specific dimensions and other statistics can be found at the Cascade Dam website from Bureau of Reclamation. There are two primary congressionally authorized uses for Cascade Reservoir. That is for irrigation and federal hydroelectric power. Reclamation has contracts with downstream irrigators, farmers, for specific amounts of storage space within the reservoir, of which we need to meet those contracts. However, that being said, recreation, fish and wildlife are recognized values, and Reclamation will do what it can to protect and enhance these values as much as possible. It's a little bit of background. So as said earlier, this reservoir is shallow, average depth around 26.5 feet. During the first 30 years of operation, it was drafted down a lot. It was drafted down to average annual down to about 16 feet. In the 1980s, there was an administrative decision made by Bureau of Reclamation to maintain the reservoir with a 300,000 acre foot minimum pool. And that equates to an average annual drawdown reduced to about 12 feet instead of 16 feet. And to put this in perspective, the difference between 12 feet and 16 feet is about 114,000 acre feet of water being held in addition to in the reservoir. This extra water has helped to maintain higher water quality and protect the reservoir fisheries from these really severe drawdowns, and to maintain recreational access in later summer season. Let's take a look at this and what this looks kind of a visual representation. Here we have a graph of Cascade Reservoir contents, the volume. The red line is how we manage it now. The blue line is how we managed it before the 300,000 acre foot minimum pool. And that space in between those is about 114,000 acre feet. May I draw your attention to right around, early July. You see these lines intersect and become very, well, on top of each other. Those happen to be where we have our salmon aug, our salmon augmentation flow requirements, and our irrigation requirements. if we looked at our typical water operations, how we operate now, if we look here, let's start in March, we have flood operations clear to about June. Flood operations, we're mandated to make space within the reservoir as per Army Corps of Engineers flood rule curves. So we release water to make space for flood operations. Beginning of June, flood operations typically ends, and we go into our flow augmentation for salmon flow waters and irrigation demands, meeting those contracts that I said earlier. That goes on from June all the way here to about beginning of October. Then we drop our flows for a minimum flow of around 200 CFS that I believe is a mandated agreement with Idaho Power. So this is our typical operations. So why show this? Our operations and the amount of water that we keep in Cascade Reservoir is, since we put in that 300,000 acre feet minimum pool, that has not given us very much wiggle room, not much flex in operations. We can, for lack of a better term, tweak some of our operations, but there's not a whole lot of room for meeting flood operations, for meeting flow log and irrigation demand, and then meeting our minimum flows. Okay. So what do we do? Well, there's a lot of stuff that we do at Cascade Reservoir for water quality. A lot of it direct and indirect benefits. One of the things that we do on resource management is outreach. In 2018 and 2019, we had an open house in Cascade. One was at the Whitewater Park and the other one was at the Boy Scout camp. And there we had Idaho Fish and Game representatives, Idaho Parks and Rec people, and a whole slew of reclamation specialists and some management there to answer individuals' questions and concerns, a lot about water quality, a lot about algae blooms, a lot about sedimentation. So this has really helped, is our the outreach we've done. Other thing that we do is we participate, though fairly sporadically, in the Valley Soil and Water Conservation District meetings. There we make contacts with individuals and have funding opportunities for small projects to help aid in water quality projects in the area. We also do quite a bit for erosion control. We encourage a special use retaining wall erosion permits from private landowners. These are people that are adjacent to the reservoir. We average anywhere between 5 to 15 of these permits a year. And just to let everyone know that these are usually pretty cut and dry and very quick for the landowner to be able to enact. However, larger projects will require Army Corps approval and DEQ review. Reclamation also works with Idaho Department of Parks and Rec with doing some retaining wall and erosion projects near rec sites. And another thing we do is signage. And this is a funny haha. We could do a lot better on signage. We're lacking a lot of signage on reclamation properties. We have new signs ordered and we have plans for future postings. And we want to use this to identify the authorized uses for the specific areas. And an example of this is maybe to restrict ATV use in some areas to prevent excess erosion or damage to the properties. We do quite a bit of land management around Cascade Reservoir. One of our focuses is on forest health. We issue special use permits to remove hazard trees from near private structures, near private lands, near trails and accesses. And probably more importantly, we have contracted with Boise National Forest for fire suppression and fuels reduction. Because of the wildland urban interface, this is very important for the area. Though I do have to say that there's been very few fires on reclamation lands. And also we do weed treatments. We contract out weed treatments. We survey around 1,000 acres and treat about 100 acres a year. These are mostly on wildlife management areas, WMAs. So the entire purpose of this forest health land management focus is to incrementally protect or improve the soils to prevent erosion into the reservoir. Oh yes, and land management would be remiss if we don't talk about fencing. Reclamation has a mix of electric barbless and pole fencing around much of our boundaries. We have a current fencing project that began in 2020 and is going on this year. It is east of the West Mountain Road from Poison Creek Recreational Area south to Reclamation Forest Service border, and I believe it's completed up to the Osprey Point. We've partnered with the Valley Soil and Watershed District and Idaho Fish and Game to do this project, and this is primarily to keep livestock out of the reservoir. Future actions. What's Reclamation plan to do in the future for Lake Cascade? We want to continue to work collaboratively with the Valley Soil and Watershed District. We want to continue to work with them, go to their meetings, have opportunities of funding projects that can benefit water quality at Cascade Reservoir. We want to continue our relationship with the Idaho Fish and Game in these projects of fencing and the stuff that we do with wildlife management areas. We also want to continue our partnership with Idaho Department of Water Quality, whether it's funding or in-kind work from our water lab here in Boise. If or when a TMDL or we have a watershed advisory group or a technical advisory group for this watershed set up, Reclamation would like to participate in that. And even local interest groups and private citizens, you have questions, concerns, or problems that maybe Reclamation can help with, give us a ring. Maybe there is something that we can do. When I set my presentation to you guys to put them together with all the other presentations, these are some useful links. We have the Cascade Dam reclamation link, the resource management plan, and the NEPA involved in that, shoreline erosion link, and then hydromet. If everyone's not introduced to hydromet, that's kind of neat. It'll tell you real-time statistics on reservoir contents and withdrawals. So if you have any questions and concerns about Bureau of Reclamation properties around Lake Cascade or any type of water quality issues, give me a ring. I'm Rich Jackson. I suggest going through the email route with this whole COVID thing. I'm not in the office very much, so if I can't answer your question, I'll find somebody who can. Thank you very much for having me. Back to you, Gary.
Richard, thank you so much. If you have a minute, there are a few questions in the Q&A that you might be able to answer.
You bet.
That'd be great. All right, we're gonna transition to our next speaker. This is District Ranger Jake Strohmeyer with Boise National Forest Water Quality Programs. Jake, take it away.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to cover kind of a general overview today of the activities on the Boise National Forest that are pertinent to this discussion, in the area surrounding Cascade Reservoir. So the Cascade Ranger District of the Boise National Forest has, a fair amount of land on both the east and west sides of Long Valley that drain into Cascade Reservoir and a portion of the North Fork of the Payette River. A lot of our work at this point in time is really focused on vegetation management type of work with the goal of improving forest health and ultimately hoping to reduce the risk of uncharacteristic wildfire. As David talked about at the beginning of this, there's a lot of the watershed that's been affected by large wildfires over the years, and that's one of our goals is to do the best that we can to try to reduce that risk of that continuing to happen. especially in the front country of the valley. So one of the projects that we have that we made a decision on to start implementing about a year and a half ago is called the French Hazard Project, and this is on West Mountain, basically from Willow Creek on the south up to Gibson Creek on the north. It has about 4,600 acres of planned treatments that we're going to do, which range from commercial timber sales to non-commercial thinning, prescribed fire, and mastication of fuels as well, especially along the private land boundary. One of the things that we always look at when we're planning on these sorts of large projects is looking at the amount of sediment that the activities are likely to produce. One of the things that one of our biggest contributors to sediment into the streams is often our road network that we have on the forest. So that's one of the things with this French Hazard Project that we really focused on, was taking a look at the road system there, deciding what we needed for the future, deciding what we didn't need for the future, and then also looking at improvements to the existing road network. So the French Hazard Project, along with all the vegetation management, will have a number of road improvements on a lot of the secondary roads, including some graveling in places to help reduce sediment off the roadbed, a lot of culvert replacements, and then also we have about 4 miles of road decommissioning in that area. There were 4 miles of road that we identified as being no longer needed for future management, that we plan on decommissioning after we use them to do some of the management activities there. So that's the main one that we have that directly affects Cascade Reservoir in the plan. We're also doing quite a bit of other stuff around the Long Valley area. In the Clear Creek drainage, we've got a couple more projects planned in the Clear Creek drainage, as well as another project just south of Cascade Reservoir in the Fawn Creek area, which is in response to a large outbreak of tussock moth that we've had over the last couple of years, trying to clean some of that stuff up. The area in Long Valley is actually part of 2 nationally significant initiatives that the Forest Service is working on. The first one is shared stewardship, and portions of the Payette and Boise National Forest make up the southern Idaho priority area for the shared stewardship program. And what that's really focused on is trying to coordinate activities that are happening on federal lands with activities that are happening on state and private timberlands. We're currently working with Tamarack Resort to do some fuels treatment around the resort area. It'll be happening on both the private land and the Forest Service land around Tamarack. The other big program that's focused around the Long Valley area is the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. Just a couple months ago, the Boise and Payette National Forests were selected for a new project that takes in pretty much all of the Cascade Ranger District, part of the Emmett Ranger District on the south, and then quite a bit of the southern Payette National Forest. Like shared stewardship, that program does have a big emphasis on vegetation treatments, but it also has a focus on watershed restoration as well. And the nice thing is that program comes along with some funding between the 2 forests. Once we start getting funded, we're hoping to bring in an additional $4 million a year that we can use to help fund the projects that we're planning, and frees up some money to do some more, watershed focused work. And so we'll be continuing to look for opportunities to do some of that work within the drainage. The next program I want to talk about is range. I know that the livestock management around the watershed is an important issue that plays into all this. And so the Cascade Ranger District has really only one range allotment that directly influences the Cascade Reservoir area or the North Fork of the Payette, or at least the upper North Fork of the Payette. and that's called the Cascade Reservoir allotment. That goes basically from the south end of the reservoir down by Campbell Creek, also up towards Gibson Creek. The allotment's been around for a long time. I don't know how long. I mean, I'm sure cows have been grazing on that ground since before the National Forest was established. However, back in the 90s, in response to a lot of the efforts going around Cascade Reservoir, the numbers and the amount of time that that permittee is allowed to graze along Cascade Reservoir was cut back significantly. It's actually the most highly managed and monitored range allotment that we have on the Boise National Forest. A very intensive pasture rotation. They're moving those cows on an average of every 2 weeks between different pastures. And then the permittee does maintain an electric fence along the reservoir to help keep cows away from the reservoir itself. Generally, they're pretty successful in doing that. Over the last couple of years, there's actually been a lot of wolf depredations on that permittee's herd that has moved the cows to places where they weren't supposed to be from time and time again. But like I said, those cows have somebody watching them all the time, and they do a pretty good job of getting them back where they're supposed to be. There's actually on the southern end of that allotment, they're only actually permitted on there for 3 weeks out of the year, from late June to middle of July, and then the north end, they run from the 1st of July till the middle of September. But that's with only about 80 pairs of cows on the north end of the allotment. So there's not a lot of cows on that portion of the reservoir. We also have some other cows on the Indian Creek allotment that is an allotment that's managed by the Payette National Forest that, generally speaking, stay up and over on West Mountain, but we do get some coming down, and some of the work that Bureau of Reclamation is doing with fencing and some of that will help stop some of that drift and getting some of the cows down into the reservoir. And then the last thing that I want to touch on, that's a major management issue for the Forest Service, is just the huge increase in recreation that we've seen over the past several years, especially this past summer. With the growth of the Treasure Valley, and this is no surprise to anyone on this conference, I'm sure, but we just saw a huge increase in people over the last couple of years, and then especially in response to COVID and people just their patterns of life being disrupted. A lot more activity on the forest in general, but also around Cascade Reservoir. We have 3 developed campgrounds on the west side of the reservoir that are basically booked to capacity during the whole during our whole reservation season. It's really hard to get, they're booked. Those campsites are booked 6 months in advance. And so what we're starting to see is folks are having a harder time finding a place to camp, and so there's more dispersed camping going along the edge of the reservoir, and people ended up in places where we haven't typically had folks camping. And so issues with human waste and other soil impacts and that sort of thing that we're looking to try to get a handle on. But it's not a challenge that I see going away anytime soon, and it may push us toward looking at some more intensive management of the recreationists along that west side of the reservoir that we manage. So, like I said, overall, I just wanted to kind of give this overview of the work that we have going on around. John Dixon from the Payette National Forest in the second session of this conference will be given a more detailed kind of technical look at what our watershed conditions and opportunities that we have to help improve watershed health. So that's all I have for you today, and thanks for having me on. I can put my contact information in the Q&A if anyone's interested in getting a hold of me or has any questions for me. Thanks.
Jake, thank you very much. There is Yeah, if you have a chance while you're in the Q&A, definitely take a look and see if you can answer any of the questions in there. We've got a couple about cattle grazing in and around the reservoir. And again, to everyone, if there are any questions that we're not able to answer at this meeting, we are recording the chat and we'll make sure those get forwarded on to future meetings as well. So we'll try and we appreciate all the attendees participating, and we're going to try and get your question answered. Going on to our next presenter, Scott Corgle. He's the area manager for the Idaho Department of Lands in the Payette Lakes Supervisory Area. Mr. Corgle has worked as a lands resource supervisor at IDL for about 15 years. He oversees the management of public trust lands, issuance of dock permits, and submerged land leases for Payette Lake marinas, management of state endowment trust land, administration of laws related to mining projects, and assistance to forest landowners. Before joining IDL, he operated his family farm in the Palouse for several years. And I think the last time I saw Scott was at the CrossFit gym, throwing some weights around. So Scott, it's good to see you again, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Gary. Yeah, I guess today, right now, I'll just kind of go over our roles and responsibilities. We wear a couple of different hats as IDL around Payette Lake, one being the largest contiguous landowner adjacent to Payette Lake. Also a regulatory hat we wear for the encroachment permitting. And first I'll touch on, as the land manager around Payette Lake on the endowment trust lands, our forest management is our biggest activity that we have around there. And the Payette Lake management plan that was implemented back in the early 90s, IDL has been following that plan on a voluntary basis because it's not law since that was the inception of that plan. And basically what that entails is our forester does annual inventory on every road, every culvert, and looking for delivery sources to any live water around Payette Lake, and that's done annually. And we also mitigate if there is any issues there. We do culvert replacement. We do mitigation projects, surfacing projects, things like that. Also, everybody's favorite thing is some places do have gates installed for those reasons as well. Basically, when we bring a new forester on here, the first rule of thumb is protect the water. That's the number one thing when you're doing any management activity on any state land, is protect the water first. The Forest Practices Act is our baseline that we use. We always strive to exceed that around Payette Lake. Obviously, that is has to do with the hazard management as well. So, the wildfire risk, things like that, it all affects the water quality as far as we're concerned. Some of the trends and challenges we're seeing in our entire supervisory area, and Jake touched on a little bit of that too, on our timber management side, is our insects and disease issues that we're having here in the valley. It's really tough to be a tree in Valley County right now. We've had drought, we've had spruce budworm outbreaks, we've had now tussock moth outbreaks, Douglas fir beetle, and around Payette Lake immediately we have had spruce budworm, and we're seeing Douglas fir beetle issues. What that means for water quality and timber management is we take an active management approach to deal with these things. And so our foresters right now are really trying to collaborate to see what the best way to try to get ahead of the insects before we have stands, what we call stands, just falling apart and becoming a huge wildfire risk. So that's a big challenge right now we're looking at and trying to mitigate. Going forward, I think we have a good plan in place. We have a couple timber sales that are going to be dealing specifically with that on both the east and west sides of the lake. The other big trend we're seeing is, just like Jake talked about, the recreation. The lands around Payette Lake are extremely, the growth and the recreation activity has been, it's always been heavily used, but it's really being used now. And the biggest issue we're seeing as far as water quality are unpermitted trail systems. And that has been the biggest source of sediment delivery that we're finding. And how we mitigated that is working with some local groups. Number one coming to mind is the Central Idaho Mountain Bike Association, and hiring a recreation specialist out of Boise named Todd Wernicks, who worked for Idaho Parks and Recreation for many years. And his knowledge of trail building, standards to put in, groups like Simba that are doing the trail building and getting those under a permit. So we have a standard and a single point of contact for some of these things. And they've been phenomenal to work with. And I think, we solved a lot of issues right there, just working with groups like that and doing more in the future. We do have portions around Payette Lake that are non-motorized, mostly put together a request of Fish and Game for sportsman purposes. And so those are enforced by Fish and Game conservation officers. And so that's been a successful program. It gives people a place that they can go recreate and hunt, mostly without the interference from motorized, but most of it is open to motorized use. So the unpermitted trail system on motorized, one of our favorite Facebook posts this year was me holding up a Carson post that had tire marks on it. So that's always going to be a challenge going forward, is hurting those cats and trying to direct people where it's safe to go recreate motorized and try to keep them out of the places where we're trying to protect. So, we also have grazing leases on both sides of the lake. The west side is more of a pass through. Sheep are the only animals that are permitted for grazing around Payette Lake. On the west side, like I said, they kind of pass through. We work in conjunction with the Payette National Forest and their grazing permits. And the lessees generally kind of bounce back and forth between state and federal lands. And we do have mitigation provisions with those grazing leases as far as where they can bed down, where they can put salt. And it's all about keeping them away from the water and creating more sediment delivery there too. So we do also have some mining leases, which they're surface rocks being plucked for decorative boulders is the main thing that's being done around Payette Lake. Most of them are outside of the McCall City impact zone, which is the 5,500 acres that everybody's heard about lately in the news, and I'm not going to get into that today. But most of those are outside of those areas up in the north end where it's, where there's a lot of rock. We have more rocks than trees, so we sell the rocks instead of the trees. The other hat that IDL wears, obviously, as Gary alluded to, was we are the jurisdictional agency for encroachment permitting on Payette Lake. So what that entails is if somebody wants a dock in front of their house, they come to us and we do the permit issuance. We do work with other agencies in conjunction with that, and notifications are sent out to Fish and Game and DEQ, Water Resources. And generally speaking, it's a pretty cut and dry process for a landowner to get an encroachment. Number one, you have to have littoral rights, which means you either have to be an owner or have some type of lease agreement with that owner, them giving them your littoral rights, moorage or any other encroachment out in the lake. In my 16 years here now, I started out as a lands and waterways resource supervisor before I became area manager. So I was the lake guy. And, the trend I'm seeing is the riprap shoreline protection projects. We've always had shoreline erosion. It's a lake. It's got decomposed granite on the shorelines. It's a natural occurrence. And so the last probably 5 to 8 years, we've seen many more requests for riprap shoreline protection from private landowners. And I think there's a couple things. Obviously, the trend that we've been seeing from people is wondering how much effect the new wake boats have, which no doubt there's some effect. To what level, I think the future presentation is going to look into that. But I think it's part of it is contractors getting better at doing it, number one, and neighbors seeing the neighbor, having that in place, and it's helping protect their ground. So we're seeing that as well. But joke here that we're building the boulder bathtub around Payette Lake, so people don't lose their ground to erosion. So that's an ongoing trend that we're seeing. Beyond putting in shoreline protection, there, we're seeing it on the river as well. We're not as much of jurisdictional authority on that. Water Resources pretty much handles that end of it, but we're seeing that, and that goes to the soil type probably more than anything. If you look at the aerial photographs of the North Fork of the Payette River in Valley County, you'll see the river, it was in a much different place than it was even 20 years ago. And as we go out and delineate ordinary high water mark, it is an interesting process to try to figure out, because if you go to the Snake River, the Salmon River, you have rock scouring, you have a lot of evidence where the ordinary high water mark would be. The Payette, it becomes a little bit more of an art than a science at times to try to figure that out, and historical flows and things like that. So it just goes to show the challenges of having any kind of watershed in this type of soil. It's going to move around, it's going to move things, it's going to fill things in. So that's going to be a constant challenge for all of us to, you know, as this valley develops further, we're looking at that as well. So anyway, that's in a nutshell, that's kind of the roles we play and some of the mitigations we're trying to put forward to protect the water quality. And that's all I have. And yeah, I'm more than happy to answer any questions.
All right, Scott, thank you very much for bringing us on home at the end of our morning's presentations. If you can take a glance at the Q&A, there are a few questions in there that some folks are asking. I've got a couple I'm going to pose to the panel, and if anybody wants to answer, please do. So let's make sure our panelists, I'll give them a color. There we go. Some lights are coming back on. The first question I have, I think it's in general, someone wants to know, are all algae blooms toxic to humans and animals? Does anyone want to pick that one up?
I can take that one if you like.
That'd be great. Go ahead, Chase.
You want me to type it in or just?
You can answer it, yeah.
Okay. So I guess a quick, sweet answer to that is that no, they're not. We typically can see blooms that may look really bad. They have high densities of cells in the water, but unless those cells are actually producing toxins within themselves, then we won't see any toxin release into the water. And so some of those toxin producing cells, what it comes down to is conditions and also the genetic makeup of the cell. So sometimes we do see toxin in the water with cells, and then other times we see a lot of cells but no toxin. So
excellent, thank you, Chase. And another question, this one may be more of a management question. Someone wants to know, says they're familiar with wetlands banking. Is there any kind of cattle banking or maybe grazing banking? Does anyone want to take that one? It's okay if we don't pick it up today, we can do it. Jake?
Yeah, it's not something that I'm familiar with, at least from the Forest Service side. So I don't know if anybody else has any ideas about it.
Okay, we'll keep that and we'll try and get to it for next time for sure. Another question I've got, is Payette Lake currently listed as a 303D impaired watershed, I'm guessing, or waterway? Somebody want that one? Is Payette Lake currently listed as a 303D?
hey, so I just put an answer on that one actually, but it's currently listed for mercury impairment, but no other impairments.
Excellent, thanks, Chase. Okay, let's see, what else do we have here? Got a few minutes, we'll do, let's see. Here's one, is there an audit that examines all water that is obligated to be released from Cascade Reservoir to ensure efficiency and conservation of use by irrigation and other consumers? And our
Hello.
panelists, you can see that. Oh, Richard's got it. Richard's got the ball. Go,
Yes.
Richard.
That's an interesting question. The state of Idaho owns the water and divvies out the water as per specific water rights. And these waters are adjudicated to those individuals. As for efficiency, efficiency is an interesting term. That is a hard one to put your thumb on, because one would argue that with many good programs of water use efficiency, such as sprinkler irrigation system, switching from a flood to a sprinkler irrigation system, that is water use efficiency. However, we also know by switching to flood to sprinkler, you lessen the opportunity for water to percolate through your soil profile into your deeper aquifer, and the opportunity of recharging a shallow to maybe a deeper aquifer. So that's a interesting question. And as of yet, I don't think that there's any committed source to ensure efficiencies. However, water as per acre feet has been adjudicated to specific entities through permitted through entities as a right to use that water. Not a great
Thank
answer,
you.
but an answer nonetheless.
Yeah, we're digging into this. Another question I've got: after grazers have converted grasses to waste material, are nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus made more transportable by runoff water? All right, I think we're gonna have to come back to that one. And also, let's see, we've got someone's asking about salmon, and it says, one presenter mentioned salmon, please explain. I'm wondering if that was in relation to water flow management. Richard, you talked about, you had some, I believe it was salmon augmentation, or can you elaborate on that part of your presentation as it relates to flow management?
Yes, so the Boise project, which is Cascade Reservoir is part of, and the Upper Snake area, which Palisades, American Falls, and so on, where we have to give a certain amount, and the amount escapes me. So I apologize for the number. I might be off a little bit, but it's like 450 or 470,000 acre feet of salmon augmentation flow water. This is specifically has to go down to the Columbia River for the use for salmon during a specified amount of time. This cannot be flood irrigation or flood waters. These have to be specific waters that we use for salmon aug. And yes, this is for salmon spawned. This was enacted, I believe, due to the 1980s biological opinion for the salmon augmentation flows below or above Brownlee Reservoir.
Excellent.
I
Thank
might
you.
add just a little bit to that. This is Ken Roberts. It was originally 427,000 acre feet. Then the Nez agreement was reached in the early 2000s, which boosted that up to 487,000 acre feet, of which the Bureau of Reclamation pulls from a number of the reservoirs from Palisades, American Falls, and others. It's the balancing of that flow augmentation water that certainly has potential for some management change in the Payette Basin.
Excellent. Thank you, Ken and Richard. Well, that wraps up our Q&A. Again, if we didn't get to your question today, we'll try and get it in front of the right expert. We had, at one point, I believe we had close to 150 or so attendees and panelists. I think it really says a lot to the importance of this issue to our community and to people's commitment to spend their time and to put their energy into learning more. And then, of course, to the experts for sharing what they know. A big thank you to everyone. I'm going to do a screen share as I wrap up. so that people can see the agenda for next time. Give me just a moment. Okay, you should be able to see at our next Watershed session will be on February 8th from 10 a.m. to around 12:30. We're going to hear from the Payette National Forest. We're going to hear from Greg Gibson, president of the Payette River Cattlemen's Association. We're going to talk about Donnelly Seeps monitoring watershed improvement projects from the Idaho Department of Fish and Game, remote sensing from Idaho Department of Environmental Quality. And we're also going to look at Valley Soil and Water Conservation District projects. We've got water quality funding programs. We'll talk about wave-induced shoreline erosion with Dr. Frank Wilhelm from U of I. And we'll look at threats to water quality for motorized recreation from Alex Ray, recent graduate with a master's in environmental management at Western Colorado University. And then we'll finish with some time for Q&A again then as well. I want to wrap up today by saying thank you all. We hope to see you on February 8th, as I stated. And this session has been recorded and will be shared within a few days on the Valley Soil and Water Conservation District website. We want to thank all our panelists. We want to thank the governor. We want to thank our local mayors for participating. And thank you again to our sponsors, the McCall, Donnelly, and Cascade Chamber of Commerce, Valley Soil and Water Conservation District, Maupin Homes, the Star News, the McCall Store, and the Cascade Store, the Big Payette Lake Water Quality Council Incorporated, Pam and Ralph Thier, and Friends of Lake Cascade. If anyone of their agency is interested in becoming a sponsor, please contact Dorina Farr at the Valley Soil and Water Conservation District. Thank you everyone for your participation, and thank you for making this Confluence Watershed Summit on the North Fork of the Payette River Watershed a success. Cheers and good day.